there's a kind of what I call second coming of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization. But Israel has relied successfully on its power to defy international law. But the right of resistance was affirmed in the decolonization process, and the right of resistance included the right of armed resistance. We need an ideology of action, should be, in my view, morally driven by an envisioning of a just world.
Welcome to the Floodgate podcast, brought to you by the Palestine Chronicle. We are here to engage with today's most pressing issues and unpack them beyond the cliches of mainstream media. I'm your host, Ramzi Baroud, and with me is the brilliant Romano Rubio, an Italian journalist and the managing editor of the Palestine Chronicle. In this episode, we are honored to have with us Professor Richard Falk, a renowned scholar in international law and a former United Nations Special Rapporteur for Palestine.
Professor Falk has spent decades examining issues of international justice, human rights, and global conflict, and his extensive body of work has focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the impact of the United States foreign policy, and the role of international institutions in protecting global rights. His critiques of global powers, especially in the US and Israel, and his advocacy for Palestinian rights have made him one of the most respected voices in the field. Professor Falk, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big admirer and reader of the Palestine Chronicle, so it's especially enjoyable for me to meet with you both.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Professor. Um, Professor Falk, you've frequently discussed the issue of complicity, specifically the complicity of global powers in perpetuating the Israeli Palestinian so called conflict. In your view, is there any meaningful pressure from within these governments to change the status quo? Or is the system of impunity simply too entrenched to change course, even amid the ongoing Israeli genocide in Gaza?
Well, that's a very fundamental question, and there's no clear answer because what's going on within the government is rather obscure. It's not easily understood by an outsider such as myself. I do think the pressure on governments arising from the bipartisan character of Israeli support and by the one-sidedness of the US Congress makes it unlikely that there will be any kind of serious challenge from within the established order. So the only promising challenge comes from civil society, and that, of course, has generated a repressive kind of response that's quite unprecedented in American political experience, going back to at least the Vietnam War, where there was opposition from the government, but no effort to seriously interfere with it, except in some 2 or 3 isolated cases. So one has a situation here that's fairly unique because it's reinforced not only by this political consensus, but by a totally unconditional Israeli Zionist network of influential support that stands as the guardian of the status quo and will punish any political any kind of political indication that there is a critical attitude toward the degree of support and the failure to react to this transparent, ongoing, cruel genocide. There's no uh, kind of comparable pressure coming from the Palestinian side.
Okay, so if you would allow me just to follow up on this a little bit, because I think it's interesting that you brought kind of the this kind of historical parallel to Vietnam, and we can apply the same thing to previous wars and other wars, including the Iraq War. I mean, what makes this unprecedented? I mean, it's not like Vietnam had a powerful lobby operating in Washington D.C. to create a counter pressure. Um, but at the same time, and though that's a war that involved Americans who were dying on a daily basis and, of course, killing in the process, we don't really see Americans sacrificing in terms of blood and resources in ways that are so significant for the government to crack down with such impunity on its own citizens and civil society. What makes Israel different, and what makes this unprecedented?
Well, I think there's several factors. I mentioned already the fact that there's a well-funded, influential, pro-Israel lobby that's been in existence for a long time and has credibility uh, politically because it successfully punished those isolated political figures that have sought to promote a more balanced foreign policy toward the Middle East generally and Israel in particular. So, and I think one shouldn't underestimate that the impact of that, because there's no upside for a politician to go against Israel. See, in the Vietnam context that you brought up, you had middle class drafted Americans dying for a war that made no sense to the US. Here, there are no Americans dying. It's just a matter of maintaining an alliance that has been justified not only ideologically by the supposed and really unconvincing shared values of the two countries, but by the interest in containing the political threats posed by the Islamic world. There's a kind of what I call second coming of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization thesis. Because if you notice, all the complicity on the Israeli side comes from Western white liberal democracies. And all the support of a tangible character comes from Islamic oriented groups in the region. So you have this kind of civilizational alignment that within which the alliance with Israel is just a piece in the larger puzzle. And therefore, it's hard to disengage that piece without challenging the puzzle itself. And that I think there's an absence of political imagination and typical politicians don't even understand this wider setting of the conflict. So those are two important reasons. The third is that the Vietnamese were very compelling in working with the U.S. peace movement in the height of the Vietnam War. I went twice to North Vietnam and met with the leadership there and was very deeply impressed by their resilience and their search for some way to achieve national liberation, essentially, and to end the colonial status that France had originally put them under, and the US was there as a sort of successor to France. But what was key, and what the US establishment learned from Vietnam, was not to have Americans in middle-class homes watching body bags on TV come back to the US. So the draft was eliminated, and TV was sort of coached or socialized into a pattern where they wouldn't deal with such provocative imagery in the future. And that was true partly in Iraq, but much more relevantly true in relation to what's been happening in Israel, Palestine, and specifically Gaza and the West Bank.
And Professor, this is like at a national level, but even at an international level. For example, when you recently launched the Gaza Tribunal Initiative, along with a group of renowned intellectuals, jurists, artists, and human rights advocates, the statement on the website read, "Why establish a People's Tribunal despite the International Court of Justice's involvement? Because the international order has failed its duty." So my question is, with rising nationalism everywhere, how do you see the future of international justice, particularly with institutions like the International Court of Justice, but even the International Criminal Court? Are they equipped to deal with the scale of atrocities that we are witnessing, for example, in Gaza today?
That's a very important question from an international order point of view. I think it needs to be understood that the UN was designed to be weak with respect to the enforcement of international law, particularly when geopolitical interests were engaged. There's no other explanation for giving the five most dangerous countries in the world the legal authority to block the organization when it comes to decision making and enforcement. So there is what I call an enforcement gap that it will not be closed unless the UN is drastically reformed, which is unlikely, or civil society is mobilized to the point where these governments feel sufficient pressure to change their policies. And the Gaza Tribunal is directed toward having some impact on what I call the enforcement gap, because the ICJ has, in its interim judgment, admirably declared the relevance and clarity of international law obligations to which Israel is subject, but Israel has relied successfully on its power to defy international law and not suffer adverse consequences. See, and the US role, and to some extent the European former colonial powers' role, is to keep that enforcement gap widely in operation. And I would just add a sentence or two by saying there's also a complicity gap where there's kind of rhetorical recognition of the relevance of complicity, but there isn't any real implementation of it, nor could there be any enforcement here also, because even if you find the US and its partners complicit, and treat that as a violation of the Genocide Convention, there would be no way to enforce that decision. And finally, the accountability gap, which means supposedly that a government and governments that violate international criminal law are subject to some accountability and some kind of punitive response. That too is subject to this geopolitical veto. So it's important to understand that the world order that was created after 1945 was a winners take all kind of order. It gave the winners the right to create an organization which a Mexican diplomat summarized as holding the mice accountable while the tigers roam free. And that's been really the story of the UN, which does a lot of useful things in other domains, but in the main domain of war prevention and global security, it was designed to be weak, and it has been weak, where geopolitical interests clash with legal authority. And we're stuck with that kind of world order. And something like the Gaza Tribunal is just a symbolic effort to resist that kind of world order and to provide a alternative framework for civil society activism that was effective in the struggle against South African apartheid and can potentially be a important factor in finally challenging this grossly horrible policy that has been dominant for so many decades now.
Okay, so Professor, you speak about this world order, like we are stuck in this world order that we have inherited from 1945 until this day. And you bring the South African scenario. Now, it seems to me that, and maybe I'm not understanding this correctly, that there are like two elements here at work. On the one hand, you have a world order that is determined by geopolitical factors, where civil society is not in any way a major player in shaping this world order. And you could also argue that the outcome of what happened in South Africa, the end of apartheid in South Africa, was also in some way or in some ways, an outcome of a geopolitical change that occurred following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the American attempt at creating a new form of hegemony worldwide. But then we also talk about civil society, about symbolic initiatives, and about attempts to balance out. You're a historian. You're not just an international, renowned international law expert, but also a historian and a very, very astute student of history. How do we balance these contradictions? Is there a historical experience that truly tells us that civil society is capable of pushing back and claiming some sort of victory over that skewed, if you will, international order that we have inherited for all these decades?
Well, that's a very hard question, Ramsey, because these factors that uh, I mentioned at the beginning are so ingrained now in the political culture of the West that it requires something very fundamental. And this idea of a winner's world coming out of World War II was also reflected in the way the war crimes trials were held at Nuremberg and Tokyo, where only the crimes of the losers were investigated and the terrible criminal acts of the winners were given impunity, not even uh, examined, including the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So when one's dealing with this very widely accepted political culture that has long exempted the geopolitical actors that control the world. And one way of reading Trump is as a post-Cold War way of establishing a new geopolitical alignment between US, Russia, and China, bypassing Europe, essentially, and creating a lot of instability in the process. It's still at a very tentative and questionable stage because China is also a rival, so it would be a geopolitical realignment and probably accompanied by a second Cold War, which already has shown some seeds of revival. So I think it's very hard for civil society to have any short-term prospect of transforming this wider world order. It could have some impact, uncertain, but some impact on the short run if these horrifying events in Gaza and the West Bank persist, because as it is, if these societies in the West, including the US, were to be genuinely democratic, they would respect the shift in public opinion, which now is quite strongly in favor of a balanced what is called a balanced approach to the Palestine-Israel conflict. But there's no sign of that penetrating the institutional structures of government in Washington. And Trump is not to blame for this. Or at least he shares the blame with his predecessors, particularly Biden, who shamelessly supported this transparent genocide, reported to the eyes and ears of the world in real time. The first instance where that happened, past genocides, even the Holocaust, were only known in their graphic detail after the fact. And as they occurred, they were rather abstract allegations without any concrete detail. Here, the detail was overwhelmingly clear, and yet the policies persisted. And it's important to recognize that the attitudes toward genocide generally have been very passive by the established order, going back to the displacement of native peoples by the British breakaway colonies, including North America, Australia, New Zealand, all of which really engaged in genocidal approaches to the native populations, and later became, after the fact, somewhat became apologetic. The Western democracies didn't do much about Hitler until he attacked Poland. They lived with a genocidal Germany and the persecution of Jews. And part of the Palestinian tragedy is that the liberal democracies emerged from World War II with a sense of deep guilt about their failure to bomb the tracks to the death camps and other indications of ambivalence toward what Germany under the Nazi leadership was doing. And they absolved their own guilt at the expense of the Palestinian people and their society. And it's part of the largely untold narrative of how Israel became such a powerful actor. And they even violated the Non-Proliferation Treaty to enable Israel to illicitly acquire nuclear weapons, and to combine that with being willing to go to war to prevent Iran from acquiring these weapons, which again is an expression of the clash of civilization approach, that you allow the Western white countries to acquire this weaponry and become part of the geopolitical hegemony that arises from the possession of these weapons, but you don't allow Islamic countries, by and large. I think Pakistan is the only exception to this idea. I mean, to some extent, I think you can call India an exception too, but it's really anti-Muslim to a degree that outdoes the West. And China and Russia are part of the hegemonic order anyway.
I just want to ask, follow up on the issue of guilt, because I feel like there is some sort of a contradiction here. I mean, the Germans have done more than the Holocaust and the murder of millions of innocent people. Uh, they have also carried out the first genocide or the first Holocaust of the 20th century against the people of Namibia. I mean, why is guilt, why is the issue of guilt a selective issue? Why do I feel guilty towards hurting someone, and I do not feel guilty towards hurting the other. Is this really about guilt or is it about power?
Well, I think it's good that you raise that issue, Ramsey. I think it's about both, and Namibia is invisible in terms of the moral radar that operates from the center of this post World War II and even pre World War II international order that descended from the 17th century Peace of Westphalia and was validated colonialism and is really, I think, best understood through the lens that Edward Said provided in terms of Orientalism, which is really can be extended to all non-Western peoples that are seen as subject to the strategic interests and priorities of the dominant actors that were initially the colonial powers, and since World War One, the U.S. and Soviet Union probably emerged as the dominant actors, and the Soviet Union provided some balance on the colonial agenda, but it really wasn't prepared in any way to challenge the notion that the international law and the UN should be weak. It lived comfortably with that because it would be very vulnerable politically and morally and legally if there was a legal order that treated equals equally.
And connecting to the complicity, and the backing and the support that Israel receives. The Israeli government continues to frame its genocidal actions in Gaza as self-defense. How do you respond, even technically, to this narrative, especially in light of the overwhelming asymmetry of power between Israel and Palestine?
Well, the rationale of self-defense is one that even Israel and its supporters are not very comfortable with pushing very hard, because as a matter of law, occupied Palestine is not a foreign state that one can invoke self-defense against, and it has not, you cannot consider the October 7th attack, which was an isolated incident, as justifying self-defense, which is supposed to only come into play in the event of an armed attack, which meant a sustained use of force and a challenge to the overall security of the state. And the notion, I mean, Israel has, and its supporters have just used the self-defense rationale opportunistically, and their real rationale is that Hamas and the Palestinians generally are terrorists, and they're outside any legal protection, as Netanyahu and Gallant, the former Minister of Defense, made clear from their immediate reaction that that the Palestinian people are what they called human animals and should be treated as such, In other words, they were outside the protective frame of law, however interpreted. And the notion, I mean, it's a ecologically regressive notion to say that animals should be treated. I mean, if you treated animals this way, it would also be a violation of a kind of morality toward living with nature rather than in some kind of aggressive, exploitative, destructive pattern of cruelty in relation to the human beings, I mean, the non-human beings that we share the planet with. So it's multiply a regressive way of talking, but it's a revealing way at the same time.
Right. And, I kind of want to reverse this element of the right to self-defense that Israel applies selectively, of course. Given the current genocide in Gaza and the failures of international diplomacy, or traditional diplomacy rather, Palestinians and their supporters are in a constant conversation about the most realistic and morally just path forward for the Palestinian people and for the Palestinian struggle, whether through armed resistance, alone, global solidarity, a different form of diplomacy, or all the above. Uh, Recently, and surprisingly, to be frank, during the testimonies at the International Court of Justice at The Hague that preceded a historic resolution by the ICJ regarding the illegality of Israeli occupation and all of that, China, or the Chinese ambassador to The Hague, made an interesting statement in which he defended the right of Palestinians to use arms against their occupiers and says this is consistent with international law. What's your take on the subject?
Yes, I think that's a correct understanding of international law that the West, by and large, doesn't want to hear about. But the right of resistance was affirmed in the decolonization process in the 1980s and 90s. And the right of resistance included the right of armed resistance. It did subject that resistance to compliance with the international law of war. So to the extent there is real evidence of atrocities accompanying the October 7th attack, those would be violations, but not the attack itself, which is something that seems in the context to be entirely justifiable, and overdue. And one of the Western Israeli tactics has been to almost succeed with decontextualizing October 7th. So it would be seen as coming out of the blue, and the UN Secretary General for even raising the most obvious point that there had been a long prehistory of abuse of the Palestinian people, was defamed as anti-Semite and all kinds of things, so that to the weaponization of anti-Semitism as an effort to insulate Israel and its supporters from criticism has had quite a strong intimidating effect on opposing these policies by people who in the security of their homes and with their friends will denounce what Israel's doing, but are afraid of taking the personal consequences of manifesting that. And people within university frameworks are similarly under threat to their careers in various ways, particularly if their citizenship status is in any way problematic or their tenure is not fully secured. So that it's a uncomfortable reality.
It is, indeed it is. And that's, I think, is one of the main obstacles that is preventing people of kind of mobilizing with very clear ideas on what needs to be done. It's just this idea that we kind of amongst ourselves, we know right from wrong, but when we go to the public sphere, we start kind of shielding ourselves and hiding behind slogans and cliches. But back to my question, because quite often the response to when we speak about Palestinian rights to use any form of defense, self-defense that they find appropriate for their own context, sometimes legal experts, of course, defending Israel, say, well, this only applies, I think, referring to Article 5 in particular, to established state. You have to be a state actor in order for you to infuse the right to self-defense. But what you are saying that this was designed specifically for decolonization, for anti-colonial movements, which by definitions are not independent sovereign states. So what is your response to those who say the right of self-defense can only apply under specific conditions?
Well, I think it's quite obvious, as you suggest, Ramsey, that the issue of the right of resistance arose because of the national movements that emerged after World War II and challenged the colonial regimes. And it was these national movements that were initially, at any rate, the focus of the right of resistance. And there's been important writing, particularly coming out of Ireland, actually, that has tried to extend that right of resistance to any situation of oppressive, externally financed and sustained governance. There's a very good recent book that is about to be published by Cambridge on the right of resistance that explores these issues in great detail. And it's a rather theoretical analysis, but a very compelling one. I wrote the foreword to the book, so I'm quite familiar with the contents.
I would like to ask you, given the violence of the situation now and even the deep polarization, where do you see the greatest opportunity for progress from here to where? And what actions or shifts could lead to meaningful change, both within the Middle East but also globally?
Well, that's a very searching question. I mean, one of the deficiencies of the present world order is the absence of any kind of visionary leadership. So one has to be rather pessimistic about the governing process leading to some progressive reforms. I do think the degree of potential unrest in civil society is probably the most fertile ground for new thinking, new acting, but it has to be mobilized in some effective ways that touch on people's lives sufficiently so they're prepared to take risks and expose themselves to various forms of pushback. And maybe, it's a sad commentary on the human species, but maybe the occurrence of some kind of wake-up call through catastrophe is the most probable way of getting any sort of meaningful change. And it could be an ecological catastrophe, because one of the features of this dysfunctional leadership in the world is to forget about climate change and ecological stability and to focus on very current events issues. And while the clock is ticking, we for other kinds of potential disasters, including recourse to nuclear weapons, which would be another way of awakening people to a system that is dysfunctional and really threatens the very survival of civilization, if not the biological species, over time. I don't think this world system can persist, even aside from its genocidal vulnerabilities. I mean, unless it addresses these fundamental global challenges. But where the political traction comes to address those fundamental challenges is rather obscure at this point. I know that's not a very satisfying response.
Well, those who are still not satisfied are going to appreciate this question in particular. Just to finish at a note of reflection and maybe some critique. You spoke earlier about what the Vietnamese have done right, their engagements with certain sectors, with American society, particularly the peace camp, and your visits to North Vietnam yourself. We know of the connection between the Palestine Solidarity Movement and South Africa, and the exchanges that are happening, not just with South Africa, but other polities within the global South to learn from one another. What is it that we, in your view, have done right, but also have done or haven't done as of yet that should or ought to be done, considering the how critical and urgent the situation is?
Well, I think to begin with, we haven't done early enough and strongly enough what we are trying to do. I mean, in other words, there hasn't been a recognition of the systemic character of the challenge, which really requires a broad movement that goes beyond trying to strengthen the UN or international law and views the political arena as one where justice must be pursued if one wants to live in a viable human future. And we should keep in mind that law is not a utopia. Far from it. It was rationalizing the dominance of the colonial powers and justifying the exploitation of the resources of the global South for centuries and decades. In fact, it emerged as an ideology of domination uh, that arose out of the religious wars in the West and the colonial ambitions throughout the world. Uh, so, so that uh, we need a ideology of action that is justice driven rather than either uh, uh, pre- reducible to law or reducible to pragmatic problem solving, each of which have a certain role, but they're limited. And the overall coherent uh, basis of collective action should be, in my view, morally driven by a envisioning of a just world and a just region and a just solution for the Palestinian people. Uh, and and I was impressed in this recent Palestinian film from Ground Zero that you probably both have seen by its non-accusatory character. You know, it tried to, and successfully, in my view, portray Palestinian resilience and creativity, and it did uh, take note of the indifferent response to the what Israel was doing, but it was basically non-accusatory and the basis of some kind of higher level of reconciliation, which was also a characteristic of Edward Said's approach to how to address these intercivilizational tensions and conflicts. He was a close friend who was teased me into Palestinian activism way back, of course, uh, because I had sort of felt that if I crossed those red lines of I'd be accused, as I was, of anti-Semitism and the like, uh, and therefore I would lose whatever credibility and effectiveness I had, and be sort of marginalized in that way. But largely his influence and the influence of Iqbal Ahmed, who is his political mentor, they and both were close friends. In fact, Iqbal was the person who introduced me to Edward originally. Uh, uh, but I would have met him anyway. He had strong Princeton ties, having gone there himself, and his children were there.
And you spoke of, and I know we are almost, we exceeded our allocated time anyway, but very, very quickly you speak of the actionable ideology, but you did not specify, is this state-driven actionable ideology, or is it civil society centered? And if it's the latter, how does the Gaza Tribunal, just to finish on that note, fits into this actionable ideology?
Well, I think the Gaza Tribunal definitely comes into being, is born out of the frustration with the formal normative order, and especially with its failures to close the enforcement gap. See, and I think the reliance is on people when governments fail. and so it's an effort to stimulate action by people designed to promote enforcement and to stop the genocide from continuing, whether it's a voice in the wilderness or somehow plays a constructive role, not only in the immediate context, but in establishing a way of thinking and acting and feeling that will affect how the future unfolds. And often for initiative of this sort, what happens after its final outcome occurs is more important than the process itself. So we have to wait and see and hope.
And finishing with the word hope, we thank very much Professor Richard Falk. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us and for your tireless efforts in the pursuit of justice and peace in Palestine and all around the world. Thank you, Richard.
Well, thank you for having me. I feel honored, and it was a pleasure talking with you both.
Thank you. And to all of our viewers, we appreciate you tuning in. The best way to push back against censorship is by engaging directly with our content. So please like, share, comment, and follow. From me and my co host, Romana, we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of The Floodgate. Thank you.
Thank you.